Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. In the wake of last week's G7 summit, we'll be asking if the world is moving closer together or further apart in the hunt to find global solutions to global problems, and finding out whether a group like the G7 remains relevant almost half a century after it was created. It was the largest gathering of world leaders face-to-face since the start of the pandemic. But in unprecedented times of global difficulty, what did the G7 summit have to say about the state of international cooperation? It may have been Joe Biden's first international outing since becoming president, but what relevance to the world did the G7 meeting really have? Does any such meeting, which doesn't include countries like China and India, matter anymore? And did it prove we need a new approach to multilateralism? With me now to consider all of that and much more are Michael O'Hanlon, author of The Art of War in an Age of Peace, US Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint, Dr. Tristan Naylor, Fellow in International Relations at the London School of Economics, and Astrid Nordin, Professor of Chinese International Relations at the Lao China Institute at King's College here in London. First of all, to Michael. Boris Johnson was the host, Michael, but all eyes really were on Joe Biden, his first big international stage or outing since becoming president. Did he have a good G7? What message was he using at G7 to send to the world?
I think it was fine as far as it went, but I do worry that the message has already exceeded its shelf life, or at least that it can't really be easily repeated. The message, of course, is America's back. We're good multilateralists now. We're nice people again. We're not going to be here to berate allies more than we do even our adversaries. The Donald Trump era is over. But of course, that doesn't really tell you what policy agenda you're going to pursue. And it also doesn't guarantee that Trump or someone like him won't come back some other day in the future. And also the looming questions about COVID response not yet being adequate. I mean, 1 billion doses is great, but there are almost 8 billion people on the planet. I feel like the substance of the policy debates was not pushed that far. But as a first meeting with him as president, it's fine. It's relatively uneventful, but it won't go down in history.
And Tristan, it was also Boris Johnson's first big post-Brexit outing and his first chance to talk about global Britain. How did he fare? And did it, in fact, show up perhaps some real divisions at G7?
Well, I think the British Prime Minister is going to be very happy that he was able to make some announcements. Whether they're really substantive on the policy front or not is debatable, but on the pandemic, on climate change, on economic recovery, he was at least able to show his credentials there. But the summit was sort of already set up for success. It's their first meeting together face-to-face in nearly 2 years. The priorities are clear. The leaders are aligned in ways that they weren't before. The new American president, of course, really being a big factor in bringing them all together. Boris Johnson could only possibly have sort of succeeded on at least in the eyes of observers of it. But I think where perhaps the problems for him lie are indeed on the divisions very close to home in UK foreign policy. Northern Ireland became the issue of the summit in many, many ways. I think it sort of knocked him off course throughout the weekend. And I really think that Prime Minister Johnson and the British cabinet is in a weaker position at this end of the weekend than they were heading into the summit, with all of their G7 allies being resolutely opposed to any amendments or transgressions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
Wasn't that just a small part of G7, though, Northern Ireland? There was criticism, certainly from Joe Biden, but there was much more on the table, even if Michael thinks it lacks substance.
Well, it was sort of a small part, and it was never meant to be a priority. It was never really meant to be an issue that was discussed here, and yet it was something that came up time and time again. It is something that every single one of the leaders, at least in the press conferences that I attended here, mentioned, spoke about. dominated coverage here in the UK. So it sort of eclipsed a lot of certainly what the British government had intended this G7 summit to be about.
All right. Well, Astrid, China, of course, isn't a member of G7. Given what Michael and Tristan are saying, do you think China would like to be a member of G7? And how much focus, how much belief does China have in what comes out of a summit like this?
I think that the Chinese were very quick in coming out and saying very publicly that actually world politics isn't determined by some little club of people who think that they are going to rule the world. And in fact, China doesn't really have to worry that much about what was being said. And besides, what was said about China was misleading and disrespectful. So I don't think Xi Jinping or any of his people were particularly sad about not being in Cornwall on this particular occasion. And also the G7 countries came together partly to articulate a vision of values and world order quite at odds with Chinese views. So clearly, China is being positioned, rhetorically at least, as an adversary increasingly to this bloc of countries. And as such, of course, China will not have had a particular longing to be there and being ganged up on, as is often perceived from Beijing. OK, Michael. We had the first steps in presenting an infrastructure proposal called Build Back Better for the World, which, of course, you will remember, we all remember, was Joe Biden's campaign slogan. The plan calls for spending hundreds of billions of dollars in collaboration with the private sector, with also some governments putting into climate standards and labour practices. Is this the West's answer to Belt and Road?
I think to an extent. I mean, I don't love the phrase. I'm not even sure it's grammatically correct. It's very American. and most of the rest of the world, most of the developing world is still trying to build for the first time, not build back better. So to me, it smacks a little too much of an American political campaign. I guess the friends of the United States and of Joe Biden were being understanding and letting him sort of come up with the slogan. But semantics aside, it clearly is the case that there needs to be a greater Western effort to invest around the world. And frankly, this is an area where China's Belt and Road can be partly healthy competition for it.
And Astrid, does Build Back Better for the World show a concern in the West, you think, about the effects and the size and scale of Belt and Road?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's clearly a response. It's nice to see that China does not have the monopoly on clunky acronyms for its
Belt and Road
global
works quite
project.
well, actually.
So just like many people have felt doubt about, well, what is a belt and what is a road and why is the road in the water and what's all this Chinese project and what can we expect from it? I think people came away from Cornwall with a lot of question marks about what this new initiative led by Biden will entail.
That's because nobody really knows what it will entail as yet. This is very early days. But I want to take you to the criticism level at China before I go back to Tristan. And a statement which China called political manipulation filled with baseless accusations. What does that tell you about the state of relations between G7 and China?
I think the comments from the Chinese side are exactly what we expect. I don't think this is a massive shift or change in the stance of either side. But of course, it's a renewal of tensions, of a positioning which pits China against a Western bloc.
Were you surprised at the strength of the final communique?
Not so much from the G7. I think the communique from NATO that came right on its tail was much stronger in its wording, listing China on a list of threats to global order and to the NATO alliance.
Well,
I think we can see the two of them together, but the wording from G7 was significantly milder, and perhaps that points to some differences in opinion on how to handle China from within the G7.
Between the EU and the US is where you mean, I suspect. Tristan,
Yeah.
how unified does the G7 appear on the subject of China? I mean, Canada, the UK and France largely endorsed Joe Biden's position and his statement, while Germany, Italy and the EU showed, should we say, more hesitancy.
I think overall they're quite unified. I think they all identify China as the major power not in the room. And I think they're all unified in identifying just how complex each of their respective relationships are with China. On some issues, it's about cooperation, such as climate change. On others, it's about competition, such as economic growth. And on others, it's very much about contestation, such as on human rights. And I think where there is divergence amongst the seven, it's in sort of the weighting of these dimensions of very complicated relationships. But overall, all the G7 leaders see China as the predominant power that must be dealt with on pretty much every global issue that the world and indeed the G7 playing a role in it needs to face.
Okay, let's turn to COVID. Michael, we had the announcement of the so-called Carbis Bay Declaration, a plan to ensure the world can prepare itself within 100 days of another pandemic. It mentions shortening the time to develop treatments, reform of the WHO, but not the lifting of vaccine patents. Does the G7 really have the power to make that happen? Don't we really need true international cooperation to make that happen, not just the 7 countries?
I'm not convinced that the patent issue is the center of it, although I think you're certainly right to put it on the table. But I think that rather, maybe to come at your question from a different angle, rather than have some kind of a hortatory goal for the next pandemic, why don't we solve this one first? And by doing so, maybe we will point the way towards addressing your concerns about how real this sort of aspirational language really is. I was slightly gratified by the aspiration to give 1 billion doses to the developing world, but that's, again, not enough for 8 billion people. And even if we can't necessarily accelerate beyond a certain point in production and distribution of vaccine right now, I at least want to see a plan that makes this happen as fast as possible for everyone on the planet, not just for the lucky billion or half billion who get the doses that we've now made available. It feels too incremental, too haphazard, almost symbolic rather than substantive. I don't want to completely belittle 1 billion doses, but it's time to actually be able to say, when are we going to vaccinate the whole planet against COVID-19? That will be, to me, more pressing than a 100-day goal for the next pandemic.
Well, a declaration of intent, Michael, perhaps. But Astrid, on COVID, China's economy has already rebounded. Its manufacturers are being flooded with orders from the US. Do you think post-G7, Beijing may well be drawing the lesson that it is therefore winning, and its best strategy is to decouple from the US on its own terms? And I wonder if that's what Beijing hopes from the new multilateralism.
Well, the question is winning at what game, right? If this is some contestation for world leadership, including a moral leadership, then certainly the failure to really step up to the plate and seize this opportunity to vaccinate the world that could have been taken by the G7 and didn't happen, left a space for China. So if what Biden wanted to do and his allies wanted to do was to show that the West offers a better and more attractive ally and leadership than China, then it hasn't quite stepped up to the mark and stepped into the space for doing so that it could have done at this G7 meeting. Whether that means a decoupling from China, well, certainly there is an aspect of saying, okay, well, if you're just going to criticize us and not want to collaborate with us and you're taking this quite confrontational stance in your communique, then maybe we look to other friends. But speaking of friends, Xi Jinping has recently also come out and said, look, China needs more friends in the world. We need to look better to people. We need to be more friendly, perhaps, in our approach. So there's a juggling act there for Xi as well. And some radical decoupling is not something I see on the horizon as part of his strategy.
Okay, let's pause there for a moment. But after the break here on the agenda, we'll be considering whether or not the G20 meeting in Rome later this year might in fact mark a breakthrough in truly global cooperation. That's to come. Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
And welcome back to the agenda. Still with me to discuss the current state of international cooperation and leadership in the wake of the recent G7 summit are Michael O'Hanlon, author of The Art of War in an Age of Peace, US Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint, Dr. Tristan Naylor, Fellow in International Relations at the London School of Economics, and Astrid Nordin, Professor of Chinese International Relations at the Lau China Institute at King's College London. Michael, President Trump was always critical of G7. His ghost was hanging over perhaps the beginning of G7, saying he didn't think the current collection was useful. He's called it very outdated. And he didn't think the countries properly represented what's going on in the world, unquote. Did this meeting prove to a certain extent that he had a point, that actually President Trump was right on this one?
Well, I do think that, as Astrid pointed out, if we had collectively promised to vaccinate the world, that would have been a good reason to have the G7. And it could have been the stated goal. And there could have been more of a plan to make that happen, more money to make that happen. And so in that sense, getting the world's great democracies together, which is what I think, it's more of a D7 than a G7. And there's some value to having that group of countries come together. It's not all the important democracies. It doesn't include India. Obviously, but it does include most of the key big Western nations. And those countries have a purpose to get together and do certain things as a group. Whether that means we have to keep exactly this G7 or modify it somewhat, I don't know. But I am sort of glad there's one forum where neither China nor Russia is present, and other opportunities can be, made available and do exist for those countries as well as India and others to be involved in the decision making. So I think of it more as a D7 than a G7, and yes, I think it's still valuable.
So still valuable as a talking shop, which is in some ways what it was always criticized for being.
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, Astrid, do you think there's any real global progress to be made at any meeting that doesn't include the behemoths like China and India?
I think talking is really important. And I think that if these G7 countries or D7 countries want to have an impact that really counts in those larger meetings where ultimate global agreements are made, then they do well to get their act together and eke out differences between themselves before they bring proposals to the table with China, with India, with Russia. So I think there's certainly a role as a talking shop, because talking shops are important.
They certainly are. Tristan, the next big meeting, the next big talking shop will be G20 in Rome, where China and India will, of course, be a part of G20, and that's late autumn in October. Is that perhaps where we can look for more or better solutions to the problems we're currently facing?
Well, we can certainly look to the G20 as necessarily being a more global approach. And indeed, when it comes to the most serious, most pressing challenges, you have to have the likes of China and India in the room as substantively equal partners. Be it on the pandemic, be it on climate change, yes, the G20 is sort of set up to be the forum in which there's likely to be, or rather there's the potential for bigger, more global, more inclusive outcomes. But on the other hand, by being a larger, by being a far more diverse club, it's much more difficult to negotiate outcomes in the G20 context. So as with every summit, it really remains to be seen whether or not it's going to produce something that is an outcome that is integrative and substantively meaningful, or
so it's like
just ends up being a talk show.
Yeah, it's like producing a new law. It's all about implementation, isn't it? Michael, do you think G7, this meeting is a good example of countries coming together to agree a post-pandemic world? In other words, they're talking about the theory of a post-pandemic world, a fairer world. And they did make some progress, or the G7 finance ministers did, with taxation, didn't they?
Yes, I do think that it is important to have some common base for how our economies integrate and how we raise revenue. Certainly in the United States, we're going to need to figure out how to raise a little more revenue or spend a little less or both. And so in that regard, I think there was a very valuable contribution. But I, again, come back to keep hitting home on what I think is the most central oversight of this particular meeting. I just don't want people to be content with 1 billion doses. It's just, we are a year and a half into COVID-19, and it's just too late to be bragging about a plan to vaccinate less than 20% of the world's population. We need plans and money and action to vaccinate everybody, whatever the time frame may be. I'm not saying that you can just issue an edict to get it done by September or December. It's going to go into 2022. We all know that. But the patent issue notwithstanding, or let's make our decision on the patent issue. And if we're not going to waive intellectual property rights, then there has to be another mechanism for expanding production more rapidly. So that's the key issue of the day. And it still wasn't addressed fast enough or well enough. And I'm not content to wait for the G20 to do it. I'd rather criticize the G7 and see if they can do better next week, even though the meeting's already over.
Okay, another key decision, Tristan, is about climate change, isn't it? President Biden, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson have already set some pretty tough targets this year. But I wonder, climate change groups are calling G7 a missed opportunity, or are they waiting until COP26 later this year?
I think that very much the G7 summit this weekend was a stepping stone to COP26, but I wasn't surprised for climate activists to be disappointed in what they found in the communique. I would have really been surprised if something big was announced here this weekend. I think it's very much being kept in the pocket for the meeting in November.
And finally, I want to get a thought from each of you, what you think this summit says about the future of global cooperation. So Astrid, beginning with you. Signs of global cooperation or global division? Or global enmity? Which one is it?
Perhaps not enmity, but certainly both collaboration and competition on the table, both between G7 countries and between G7 and China. I think a topic of conversation between us here today has been the missed opportunity to really step into that leadership space and show that democracies can do better, they can be better for the environment, for their populations, for human rights. And it's only through leading by action that the US and its G7 allies will be able to step into that space that it wants to take, rather than leave it open for China to step into.
And Tristan, a missed opportunity or not?
Well, there'll be missed opportunities with some issues and not with others. I think where there was some success was in re-articulating what the identity and role of the G7 is going forward. And I echo something that Michael was saying earlier, that the G7 is beginning to transform itself after at least a decade of sort of relative listlessness into being a club of democracies, principally oriented around the protection and promotion of democracies. We saw that here this weekend in the rhetoric. We saw this in the invited guests this weekend of South Korea, South Africa, India, and Australia. So that's where I sort of see this weekend leading us in the mid to long term.
And Michael O'Hanlon, your thoughts about this summer and the future of global cooperation and perhaps global leadership too?
Well, I agree with my colleagues. I was also gratified that in the discussion of China, the differences and the critiques were specific and a little bit more restrained than we've sometimes seen coming out of Washington. So take, for example, the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang province. I've objected strenuously to the US designation of China as committing genocide in that province. I don't think that's the right word. I think it's unnecessarily inflammatory. On the other hand, I don't agree with everything China's doing in Xinjiang. And I thought the G7 was a little more businesslike, but still resolute and firm and clear in making its views known. So I think the collective voice of these democracies was better than the individual voice from Washington, and a little more restrained, which I think is more hopeful for building as much cooperation with Beijing going forward as we can.
Michael O'Hanlon of Brookings Institution, Dr. Tristan Naylor from the London School of Economics, and Professor Astrid Norden of the Lao China Institute at King's College. Many thanks to you all today.
Thank you.
G7 is an odd global grouping made up, as it is, of the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Italy and Canada. China and India are outside, not to mention quite a few other countries whose economies are, in fact, larger than Canada's. Sometimes the group is referred to as the world's 7 most industrialized countries. But if this was just about true when the group was founded in 1975, it certainly isn't now. Some other countries are more industrialized, such as South Korea and China, while both the US and UK have a pretty low percentage of manufacturing GDP. But this was President Biden's first G7 as president, and he stepped onto the world stage to announce that America is back after the trauma and the tantrums of the Trump era. But this was also the host, Boris Johnson's first big chance to show what he means post-Brexit by global Britain. But in the end, the rhetoric seemed more impressive than the substance. While vaccine campaigns are well underway in the developed world, the same can't be said for the developing world, where only a fraction of people have access to jabs. G7 leaders pledged to provide 870 million doses directly over the next year, bringing the total pledged since the start of the pandemic to about 1 billion. But that was termed a missed opportunity by critics. There's also a link to climate change. If the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow is to be as ambitious as the UK hopes it will be, it needs to win support from developing countries to decarbonise their economies. If those countries are still battling COVID, then they will be even less able and willing to invest in clean energy than they might be otherwise. And there seemed to be division too between the US and EU on future relations with China. In their final statement, the G7 leaders urged China to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. China's embassy in the UK replied by accusing G7 of baseless accusations and political manipulation. And that perhaps is the key issue with the G7. Perhaps it's really time to question what role it can truly have in improving international cooperation when some of the world's major forces aren't invited to the table. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, the future's electric. But is the world really ready to turn its back on the internal combustion engine? But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.